Today I want to do a controversial discussion video. I'm hoping everyone will play civil in the comments and know that I'm trying to address this in a holistic way, but I'm going to finally tackle the very controversial discussion surrounding problematic authors. Now, if you're not familiar with that phrase, this is going to cover authors who in one way or another have done something in their personal life or something about their personal beliefs that has become public that is differing in a very controversial way to your own moral code. And this can be a whole host of different things, and I'm not going to purposely pick on any one author. Definitely there's authors I'm going to be alluding to, but I'm going to keep this video more about broad statements and strategies that I use to try to tackle this topic. I think that this can be, again, very controversial. Usually people swing straight to one side or the other, and I want to try to give a middle perspective and kind of talk about it in hopefully a more nuanced way, considering different factors. If you're game for a conversation like this, again, let's keep it civil. Even if you disagree with me, let's please keep it a good discussion, because I think that by talking about something, it allows us to see different perspectives, understand each other better, and hopefully come to some good conclusions, or at least challenge our preconceived ideas on the topic. So all that being said, let's get started. So I think that the conversation around problematic authors has really grown in recent years as many current authors have become more of a public persona as they are on Twitter or X or Instagram, all of these different public social media platforms. And on top of just advertising and promoting their books, they start to actually share a lot of their personal opinions, whether it be about politics, religion, whether they are discussing different races or different beliefs surrounding homophobia and so forth, and all of the different topics that can get really dicey. And I'm never in this video going to defend anyone for having views that I consider to be immoral, and I'm not in any way going to apologize for them, but I'm going to address the fact that myself as a reader have come into the situation where I've wanted to read a book, but I discover something about the author that makes it very troubling, and I have to decide whether or not to proceed to read their book and review it. And then you also have situations where you've already read a book, you love it, it's one of your personal favorites, maybe a childhood favorite in some particular instances, and then you find out things about the author that make you feel differently about supporting their work. So I want to preface this video by saying that in my personal belief, someone like myself who has a social media platform and has a decent number of people watching their reviews, I do feel that I should be held to a higher measuring stick in terms of being more careful how I am promoting authors that are potentially problematic, because of the fact that if I read and recommend a book to you all, even if I say got that book from the library and I'm not personally supporting that author financially, I realize that by saying this book is fantastic, I love it, you should go out and read it, there's a good chance other people are going to buy the book, going to tell their friends, and I'm just basically putting it up on a pedestal and giving it that extra promotion. And so there is that question about the morality or the ethics surrounding promoting certain authors when I know that the author themselves has done some questionable things. However, I do think that individual readers, those that say don't have a social media platform, maybe you have 3 friends that follow you on Goodreads, those individuals are perhaps a little bit more isolated, and so even if you read and love a book, your own reading experience, your decision whether or not you buy the book or recommend it and so forth, probably has less of a ripple effect. I know before I got a review channel, when I was just a normal citizen just reading books on my own, I would sing the praises of a book all around my friends and family and no one would pick it up. So I didn't have a lot of influence, and so it kind of goes back to that old Spider-Man quote, but I do believe that with great power comes great responsibility. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about me as an individual, but also recognizing that I will never judge someone for, in their own personal life, choosing to read something that perhaps I wouldn't, just because I do think people are in different situations and everyone has to make those moral decisions and ethical decisions for themselves. So I'm going to preface that I really do think there's a lot of it depends in this discussion, which is why I want to have this discussion in the first place, is I don't see it as black and white. Now, for me, I want to go through the 3 main considerations that I think about when I'm determining whether or not I want to pick up a book that I already know is by an author who I consider to be problematic for one reason or another. The first thing I do is consider really who the author is. Specifically, are they living? And if they are no longer living today, or at the time the book was written, what was the world like? And so I do give different considerations to an author that is perhaps quote unquote of their time. So recognizing that an author who wrote a book during a time where slavery was still happening is going to have different views that perhaps will seep into their story. You're going to look at different points in times when different racial stereotypes and stigmas were considered more socially acceptable or more widespread, and we perhaps don't have the nuance and social commentary and considerations that are more prevalent today. So I do not necessarily give the author a pass, but I always want to consider the book within the time period where it is set, because we talk about these iconic figures within history that happen to have slaves and all of the things that made them very imperfect by today's standards. And I think we would judge them differently if they were current authors writing today. And I do make that differentiation. So even for myself, I've mentioned authors, say, who have been known for having very horrible racial opinions that have been documented in their historical work. However, that alone does not make me consider that I won't read that author if that is just of the time period. And that leads into my second consideration, and that's the fact that I want to know whether or not the author's problematic opinions, beliefs, etc. seep into their work. And so I've gotten myself in trouble in the past for not really explaining this in previous videos, but I'm aware of authors that have some really dark beliefs and opinions, which again are documented and proven that they are things that the author believed, and I definitely judge those beliefs. However, what really stops me from enjoying an author's work is if those beliefs are woven into the thread of the story. Again, I recognize that some things are a point in time where, again, everyone was speaking that way and everyone was using certain slurs, and so I can give the author a pass to a degree, but because of my own sensibilities of the time that I'm raised in, the beliefs that I hold, things like that, there is a point where I won't necessarily not read a book, but if I'm reading a book and I find that those elements are so woven and seeped into the story that it's affecting my enjoyment, that's where I struggle. So it's not to say that I will never read those books, but I do feel like if the author's individual beliefs are impacting the actual storytelling and is being biased in that way, it does create a conflict for me. And typically it's just, again, I will read the story, but I might enjoy it less. And I try as best I can to separate the art from the artist. But sometimes if the artist gets inside their work, and that for me can become a problem if I can see the heavy-handed voice of the author playing out through the voice of their characters. That being said, I always want to make a consideration that I read plenty of terrible books that have really unlikable characters that do horrible moral things. And I do have to recognize as a reader and reviewer that there are very good moral conscious authors who choose to write really despicable characters that I happen to enjoy. And so I think it's always that tricky line, because if you didn't actually know anything about the author's backstory, their personal life and information, it can be hard to tell where those beliefs are coming from, or if they're simply written for the sake of a story and meant to do something else. And so as best I can within my realm of being a reviewer, I do really try to find that line of, okay, is the author overstepping and trying to preach on a soapbox, using their story as that way to elevate their voice? Or are they using these problematic elements in a way to create a bigger conversation? Are they creating a unlikable villainous character that has unlikable traits within their story because they want to emphasize the fact that this person is not good? Or are they trying to make a different statement? So again, it gets really confusing and nuanced. I know even in my past reviewing life, I've talked about it where I've had authors that have done this and had really terrible characters say really terrible things, and I confused myself and really felt like it was the author saying something when it really was just their character. And when I actually went and learned more about the author and realized some of their perhaps progressive opinions and beliefs, realizing that, you know, nice people can write terrible characters, and on the flip side, terrible authors can write beautiful stories and beautiful characters. And that's the other thing too, is I will make a note that there are authors who I strongly disagree with what they say in their personal life, what they have as online propaganda, what they push forward, and they're very public about some beliefs that I strongly disagree with and I will not support in that way. However, I happen to know specific examples where these authors, who again have beliefs that in my mind feel very horrible, have written books that feel very beautiful. They can write stories about acceptance and adversity, and it's almost the opposite, where you can have an author who has these elements to them that I find very disturbing in the things that they believe, but yet can separate themselves in their art and actually write something that if I didn't know it, I would believe to be from an author who believed different things, if that makes any sense. So I definitely think that there is a question about how is the author influencing their book and giving permission for authors to write nasty stories, nasty morals, and nasty ethics, because I think those stories need to exist, and making sure that we're not blaming or mashing together the art and the artist too much, because I do think as a society we tend to do that a little bit more than I'd like like to. And the last consideration I think about is whether or not the author, who, if they are living today, are using their current book revenues to help to fund projects and ideas and organizations that I find to be very harmful. And so that's something I do consider. And again, I talk about it where technically I can get a book from a library, but there is something to consider that first off with the library still buys a copy. And again, for someone in my position, it's still more harmful in my mind because of the fact that if I hold up a book and say, I love this book, it's great, it's so much fun, you all might go out and buy 100 copies of that. I don't know how much influence I really have, but you get the idea there. So I'm always mindful of that. And this probably is the consideration that trips me up the most, and I don't fully have it all figured out. Basically what it comes down to is that I don't go out of my way to seek out and promote authors that I find to be harmful. I do read books by authors that are otherwise considered problematic, but they're not the authors I'm spending a lot of my time, energy, and money to seek out, because there are a lot of authors who aren't necessarily problematic that I would love to promote instead. And again, I don't research every author I read. In fact, I typically don't. I don't spend a lot of time on book social media other than being on YouTube, of course, but that's more as a content creator rather than a viewer. So consider all of these things, but at the end of the day, I make human choices. Sometimes I will give more leeway to reading someone who is perhaps problematic versus another author who, for whatever reason, what they are considered problematic about might kind of bother me in a way that really changes my opinion on something. So it definitely isn't always a strict black and white policy, but something that I'm continually working on, continuing to consider and talk about, which is why I want to bring this to the forefront of my channel and have a chance for us all to discuss online. I know for a lot of people, they say, I just want to read a good book, and that is all they are looking for, and we'll get into that in a moment. The other consideration I want to mention is I get a lot of people asking me saying, wow, I bought all of this author's work, and maybe you've read it, maybe you haven't, and then you discover them to be problematic. I personally don't believe that you have to burn your books or throw them in the garbage just because you find out the author is problematic. I do believe that the art can belong to the reader, especially if you've already read it and has a personal connection for you. I know for myself, like many readers, there are certain books from my childhood that mean so much to me that I now have more mixed feelings about because of some of the authors and what they have said and done in the past years. But I still hold on to the copies of those books. I will still read them. I might spend less of my personal time promoting them on the internet, but what I do with my books in my own time in the privacy of my house, I do not judge you for doing what you consider to be right by you. And I don't encourage people that they have to throw out all their books. If books have meaning and connection for you and it becomes about your story as you are growing up or different points in life that book represents, please hang on to it. Please enjoy the story that it was and let that be an experience for yourself, even if you don't support the author. Finally, let me wrap up this video by discussing a little bit more the concept of those individuals, and I know it's going to come up in the discussion in the comments, where you say, I don't care about the author, I just want to read a good book. And I would argue that by making a decision and a statement that you will not care about what an author does, you do not care if an author is problematic, and you decide that you're going to stay above the politics in its own way, you are still making a political statement. You're making a certain one. So I think that's my one point, is just to be a little bit aware of that. But all that being said, I don't want any pitchforks coming my way. So again, I just want to open up this conversation because again, I've talked to people who read whatever, don't care, those that will completely burn books to the ground if they find out the author is problematic. And then I suspect there's more readers like myself that fall somewhere in the middle, where we try to live our lives in an ethical way and include our reading life in that feeling or pressure to live by a certain ethical or moral code. But in execution of that, in actual practical terms, that becomes a lot more complicated, because if everyone is gushing about the most amazing book of the year, and I happen to know that the author has done some questionable things, I'm still tempted to read that book. And in some cases, I do read that book because I want to have an opinion. I want to discuss the art. I want to know what it's all about. And I think it's really tricky. The part I haven't gone into as much in this video, at least for me, is the fact that when we're talking about problematic authors, we use that as an umbrella term. And I would argue that a lot of what we need to really dissect is the different layers of problematic authors, and they often tend to get lumped in together. And I don't need to get into really any specific examples, but I think you know what I mean, that there's certain authors who have said something rude online and will be lumped in with a problematic author who perhaps has said something horrific and has done so much more. And so I do think that it's arranged. So I really just fall somewhere in the middle, and that's why I want to know what you all think, because I want to make sure I'm, again, reading and reviewing with some moral considerations in mind, but then I also want to be free to give different opinions, different discussions. And that's a big thing too, is I'm also very adverse to book banning, and going down the road of saying I'm never going to read this author because I've heard this or that about them is a very slippery slope as well, because we've seen what people do when you have parents who ban books from school and go on tyrants, is they often have not read the material, and again are assuming that just because the author has some problematic elements to them, they assume that the book itself has no merit. And I think that we're just making the conversation too simple when we simply lump everyone together and cut everything out. And instead, one of the things I love most about book reading and reviewing and the experience of consuming books is that it challenges our beliefs. And so for myself, I do choose at times to pick up books by controversial authors that have controversial topics that I don't necessarily agree with, because if I just stop reading those stories, if I stop listening to those other opinions and I'm not even aware what's happening, I also think that we can fall into the trap of being ignorant. Sometimes I still want to challenge myself, make sure that I'm listening to everyone and that my opinions are able to be updated and change as the world changes and I get new information. So I don't know if this video made a lot of sense. I'd love to hear down below, what are your opinions on problematic authors? You can discuss specific authors if you want, or keep it vague like I did. If you enjoyed discussion videos like this, I hope you stick around, subscribe. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, and fantasy and other dark things. If you want to support me with this video, you can give me a big thumbs up. And you know what? If you disagree, you can give me a thumbs down too. At least shows YouTube that you're interacting with my video. If you want to drop an emoji in the comments, that'd be great, but I'd prefer you do a longer comment. I would love to hear people's thoughts and opinions on this very controversial topic. I hope I haven't lost you and you all haven't unsubscribed at this point, because I would just, I think it's a complicated issue and I don't have all the answers, so I just want to share what I'm doing and check in with the internet to see what you all are thinking too. All that being said, I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.